Hello, everyone. You know me, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holowchak, and this is One Word, Five Questions. I'll be joined today with my co-hosts, Donna Vitek and Dave Dietrich, who is in some swampland somewhere. Do you want to tell us where you are, Dave?
Yeah, I'm in Buckingham County, Virginia, and I'm on a trail that used to be the road that Thomas Jefferson would take going from Monticello to Poplar Forest. And the waterway you see in the background is the James River, and that's where the ferry crossing was located that he would use to make the trip.
All right. I think I was there with you. Was
Yep.
I not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's actually a kind of cool thing, and it's a little bit of history there. Okay, let's talk a little bit. I'm going to introduce the show, and then Donna Vitek's going to tell us a little bit about her choice of the case of Marbury versus Madison.
Yeah.
And she'll give us a brief synopsis, and we'll follow with a discussion. What is the Real Thomas Jefferson? This is an alternative program to our One Word, Five Questions. The motivation here is to disentangle the Real Thomas Jefferson from all the garbage you get today that's fed to us from the multiculturalists, from the progressivists, the postmodernists, the Foucaultianists, the revisionists. The idea is to resuscitate, to give a sort of recrudescence. I don't know what that means either, so don't worry about it. Resuscitate the actual Thomas Jefferson insofar as he is knowable. Merrill Peterson, in his one of his great books, talked about the difficulty in knowing Jefferson because of Jefferson's dimensionality and his depth. Peter Onuf took it a step further and just said, you can't know Jefferson because he's not two-faced, he's 20 or 30-faced, and he panders to the interests of his correspondents, and all we get is Jefferson who's pandering to correspondents. There is, in effect, no real Jefferson. That's not true. Knowing the real Jefferson is difficult. This show is about getting at the real Jefferson and tearing away at the progressivism, postmodernism, and the revisionism. So let's going to begin. Donna Vitek, who chose Marbury versus Madison, is going to give us a brief synopsis.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Holowchak. Yes, I chose this because I want to know Thomas Jefferson's involvement and his position in the Marbury, in such a big case, a landmark case. So I chose this case. Also, boy, if you thought Luke and Laura was juicy on General Hospital 30 years ago, wait till you hear this.
You are showing your age.
Oh yeah,
Laura.
30, I should have said that. In 1801, after serving only one term as president, Federalist John Adams was set to leave office after being defeated by Republican Thomas Jefferson in the presidential race. John Adams was not pleased that his former, and I say former friend, and we'll learn why later, and Republican would be taking over as the new president. At that time, John Marshall was first John Adams Secretary of State. A few weeks before he left office, Adams appointed Marshall as the fourth Chief Justice. So he was originally supposed to be the Secretary of War, but was placed in a position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court due to his opposition to the Jeffersonian values. So this was all very calculated by John Adams. At that time, John Marshall was, I'm sorry, move on. The night before he was set to leave office, Adams was concerned about the future of federalism under Jefferson's rule, because we all know Jefferson was not a Federalist. And he signed 42 commissions appointing Federalists to different positions within the federal courts. Adams also passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which expanded the size of the federal courts and their judicial jurisdiction. Secretary of State John Marshall, he was still Secretary of State at the time, was set to deliver these commissions to the newly appointed justices, but most were delivered except for a few. Once Jefferson took office, he found the undelivered commissions and withheld them from being delivered. He also reduced the number of justices from 42 to 30 and replaced 5 of the appointments with Republicans. So Jefferson asked John Marshall to remain in office until his new Secretary of State, which is James Madison, till he arrived. So Marshall remained in office from January to March, and the commissions were never delivered. Yeah, it's
Such animation, Donna. Gee.
well, because it's so juicy, and none of it makes sense. And I wish I could have been a fly on the wall back then. Like, deliver the commissions. You're still the acting Secretary of State, right? He had 3 months extension to do it, and it was to make sure it was done, and it was never done. So once Madison arrived, he was instructed by Jefferson not to deliver the commissions. So there were a total of 17 undelivered commissions. William Marbury was one. He petitioned the court to issue a writ of mandamus, which would mandate the government to deliver his commission. And this was based on the Judiciary Act of 1789. So now back to Marshall. Knowing that his order to deliver commissions would be ignored by Jefferson, he thought it would make him look weak. So he made the final judgment that the Judiciary Act gave him the power to compel Madison to issue the commission, that it was unconstitutional. So he had to save face by doing this. Now, there's a little bit of conflict of interest here, I see, because John Marshall was the Secretary of State that was supposed to deliver the commissions, and now he's the sitting justice hearing the case.
Okay.
Yeah. So that would be a conflict of interest today, don't you think? Yeah. So now we're going to hear about Jefferson's part. What part did Jefferson play in all of this?
Okay, thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
Now for the sticky minutia. Some questions. Question number 1. Are you ready, Dr. Holowchak?
I'm going to try.
Okay, good. John Adams's presidency set the tension for Marbury v. Madison. We know that. Tell us a little about Thomas Jefferson's relationship with John Adams at that time. And we're talking again, the first political party system.
Yeah, the relationship was strained. John Adams had a liking for Jefferson when he took office, and he certainly expected Jefferson to be an integral part of his presidency, and he was soon disabused of that notion by some of the radical high Federalists in his cabinet and so forth. So Adams was, to use a technical term, pissed that when Jefferson, when Jefferson would assume the presidency. But there was a strain here. So Adams did not even stay in Philadelphia when Jefferson was sworn in as president. Okay, so there was that sort of tension. And I'm going to read something that Jefferson says to Elbridge Gerry in 13 May 1797. He tells Gerry that you express apprehensions that stratagems will be used to produce a misunderstanding between the president and myself. All this is hinting at tension between Adams's cabinet and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's admitting it. His cabinet is forcing Adams to pull away from Jefferson. But not a word having this tendency has ever been hazarded to me by anyone. Yet I consider it as a certainty that nothing will be left untried to alienate him from me. These machinations will proceed from the Hamiltonians by whom he is surrounded and who are only a little less hostile to him than to me. What Jefferson's hinting at is something I believe and others have said, that Adams lost control of his cabinet. There were a lot of high Federalists in the cabinet, and at some point, the cabinet turned Adams away from Jefferson. Adams always loved Jefferson. So the relationship was strained. It was not a relationship of hatred. Of course, the Alien Sedition Acts did nothing to make Jefferson, to endear Jefferson to Adams as well. So much for that. We have a strained relationship.
Was their relationship, so up until this point, it was still good? Because they were close to being best friends, or
comrades. Yes, they were comrades in founding a new country. Adams always loved him. He says that later. He said, I always loved you, when they reconciled. wouldn't consider them enemies at this point.
Okay.
The one thing I could say is, why did Adams lose control over his presidency in some sense? That's an interesting question. If I'm right in saying that he did, I think he did. I don't hear you, Dave.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
That would make for a good commercial. Can you hear me now?
I think it's already been tried.
It has.
But anyway, in the latter half of the 1780s, of course, Jefferson and Adams are both in Europe. Jefferson at the time is the minister to the court of Louis XVI in Paris, and John Adams is the minister to the court of St. James in London. And they correspond. They also get together at one point, I believe it's in London, to tour, and elsewhere to tour some gardens. So they have quite a good relationship, even in as late as that period of history. Then comes the first political party system, and of course it blows up.
Okay. My dog gave a big yawn, Dave. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. He just went, huh.
Hi, Daffy.
That's an endorsement. You know that.
Yeah.
All right.
We're good at putting people to sleep, even dogs.
I don't think so. He's just tired, just cold for him.
Is that your dog, TJ or John Adams?
That's TJ. That's JJ. Actually, Jefferson Jackson. I don't know how he got Jackson. Anyways, all right. Question 2.
Okay, question two. James Madison was John Adams' Secretary of State. Donna already mentioned that. What does that say about James Madison? Does it tell us anything about him?
Oh,
Well,
John Marshall. John Marshall.
John Marshall. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Let me back up. John Marshall. I saw JM. John Marshall.
Yeah, Marshall
What is it?
was chosen. His cabinet was Vice President Thomas Jefferson, Timothy Pickering, Secretary of State, then John Marshall, Secretary of State at 1800. So Marshall comes in late. At the same time, he's going to be appointed to, this is the conflict of interest to which Ms. Vitek was talking about. He's both, Charles Lee was Attorney General, Oliver Wolcott, Secretary of Treasury. In 1801, Samuel Dexter becomes Secretary of Treasury. James McHenry, Secretary of War, and then Dexter, prior to he's Secretary of War in 1800, 1801. So Dexter goes from Secretary of War in 1801, and then somewhere in the time in 1801, he becomes Secretary of Treasury. Now, 3 of these people, Pickering, Wolcott, and McHenry, are hardcore high Federalists. And we know that they are on record going right to Alexander Hamilton in New York to share with him the goings on in, the Adams administration and getting his advice on what to do. And Adams, many historians have noticed this, he oftentimes deferred to his cabinet and in some sense was forced to defer to them, to the high Federalist element of his cabinet. So it was, as I think Gordon Wood makes this point as well, that that Hamilton, you can question the extent to which Hamilton had control of his cabinet. I think what happened is the cabinet gets run by the high Federalists, and Adams is prohibited from having a more conciliatory approach. Adams is certainly a Federalist. He's not a high Federalist, a hard Federalist. And I think he's forced from having a conciliatory approach and involving Jefferson, who was his dear friend, early on in his presidency. The Alien Sedition Acts caused the wedge. So, yeah, the fact that he becomes Secretary of Treasury shows that, again, we've got to have this strong Federalist influence. Is that good enough for you, Dave?
I think that's a pretty good answer. Ready for question 3?
I am.
Okay. Now we're talking about
John Marshall.
John Marshall here. I see the JM again. It's messing me up. Sorry.
He
John
did that on
Marshall was
purpose.
acting. Sorry.
He did that on purpose.
They had the same names.
He's crafty.
Did you say
John-
crappy or crafty?
Either one, you can use either. John Marshall was acting Secretary of State and Chief Justice, right? Was that not a conflict of interest? You know, you would think on the surface it would be to a certain degree, but anyway, what do you think on that, Dr. Holowchak?
Yeah, today would be a conflict of interest. There's no question. Even back then, there probably was, because you're asking someone who has duties in one branch of the federal government. You know, he's linked with the presidency as part of his cabinet. Then he's also going to be linked with another branch of the tripartite government with the judiciary as the person who's in charge of the Supreme Court. And is that intentional? Certainly, probably, yeah. And, you know, so I only had one thing, is that we don't think of the duties that someone had, say, Secretary of Treasury like Hamilton in Washington's day, or Jefferson's Secretary of State. We tend to think Secretary of State is confined only to matters of state and state security, so forth. At the time, even in Jefferson's day, Adams' day, even in Washington's day, all people got together and discussed all issues. And it wasn't like, okay, there was a sense in which Jefferson was angry at Hamilton in Washington's cabinet because Hamilton kept stepping on his toes and intervening in his affairs as Secretary of State. So there's a sense in which there was a rough idea of boundary lines, but I want to emphasize there was only just a rough idea.
You know, a follow-on to that, it kind of suggests a question here that you see the involvement indirectly of Hamilton. Is it safe to say that in this period of history, he might have qualified as kind of a great eminence, or is that a little bit too strong at this point?
Oh, he had a tremendous following. And when Jefferson was elected president, for example, he pretty much decided that issue through negotiations, behind-the-scenes negotiations, just in terms of, you know, Hamilton hated Jefferson, but he hated Burr more. So he convinced people to go with Jefferson instead of Burr. Adams was a major player. It's a book by Gordon Wood where he talks about Washington and Jefferson. It's a fairly well-written book. Talks about the influence of Hamilton and Jefferson on the Washington presidency. And, you know, the notion is that Washington sided with Hamilton almost all the time. And that's just not true, because Washington sided with Jefferson on almost as many cases, if not as many. The problem is that on some of the more important issues, he tended to side with Hamilton, and Washington slid over time in a Hamiltonian direction and Federalist sort of direction, even though I think it's bad to say he was a partisan politician. Sneaking in an extra question, Dave.
Well, what I'm curious about is what were the Jeffersonian values that they were trying to circumvent here?
Value so much, it's just different visions of government, centralized versus decentralized, strong executive, massive federal debt versus no debt. Jefferson wanted demassified government, and Hamilton wanted massified. Hamilton was just looking at Britain as a model. He thought it was the most perfect government with its flaws. If you eliminate the flaws, you remove its perfection. And Jefferson, you know, as we said a number of times on the show, thought if you're going to have a revolution to get away from the British, there has to be some defects with the British government. So we need to try something different. We need to have demassified government, stay away from debt. We need to have generational sovereignty. Ties into the notion of no debt, right? We don't want to bring debt to. It's just a different vision of government. Government by the people versus government by an aristocracy.
Yeah, from my readings, I think I mentioned in my email, there was a professor that mentioned that John Adams thought that that he was that Thomas Jefferson was going to destroy American society. Like it was.
Yeah. See, he got accused of being a Jacobin, basically, and that was totally unfounded, I would argue. Jefferson certainly believed that the march of history in France, going from a monarchy, absolute monarchy, to constitutional monarchy, to even a republic, was a good thing. But once it got ugly, really ugly, in the late 1780s, then that was a different animal. Or I'm sorry, the 90s. That was a different animal, and he certainly didn't subscribe to the views of people like Robespierre, not at all. But that didn't matter because he got accused of that.
All right, next one.
Okay. These appointments of federal judges were legitimized under John Adams in the 1801 Judiciary Act. Just what was this law?
I said it was enacted in 1801, and it added 6 circuit courts and 16 Federalist judges. And here they're appointed for life. Federalist marshals, district attorneys, justices of the peace in Washington. The idea was to stack the judiciary with Federalists. Jefferson took over the executive. The Congress was going to be flooded with Republicans. And Adams, at least Jefferson, thought this is a desperate attempt. Well, if they're going to take control over 2 parts of the tricameralist government we have here, we're going to dominate the judiciary and do so. These are appointments for life. Do so for a very, very long time. And Jefferson took exception to that. Again, we talked about how he added John Marshall to be Chief Justice of the country. These became known as the midnight appointments, and Jefferson was furious insofar as he could get furious about this last act of desperation, and he held John Adams accountable for it as well as he should, right?
He was John Adams' vice president at the time too.
Yeah. What did TJ think about the appointments?
Here I picked out a couple things to read. Of course, he wasn't happy about them. He writes to John Dickinson on December 1981, on their part, they have retired into the judiciary as a stronghold. The remains of federalism are to be preserved and fed from the treasury. And from that battery, all the works of republicanism are to be beaten down and erased by a fraudulent use of the Constitution, which has made judges irremovable. They have multiplied useless judges merely to strengthen their phalanx. He's using a military terminology. And Jefferson's absolutely right here. A fraudulent use of the Constitution means, what's the constitutional warrant for Adams taking the step? Does anything in the Constitution say the president has the power to do that? There's nothing. To Abigail Adams, 1804, this is when Jefferson's daughter Maria dies, and Abigail breaks down because Abigail met with Maria in England and she fell in love with the young child who was 8 at the time, and she writes a very consoling letter to Jefferson, and Jefferson responds back, I can say with truth that one act of Mr. Adams' life, and only one and only one, ever gave me a moment's personal displeasure. That rules out the Alien Sedition Acts. I consider his last appointments to office as personally unkind. They were from among my most ardent political enemies, from whom no faithful cooperation could ever be expected, right? The idea is he was angry about this. The suggestion is the Alien Sedition Acts he could tolerate. He responded to them with the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. He wrote the latter. Abigail writes back, and instead of meeting him halfway, she dumps all over him. I mean, she was a vicious, vicious woman, and when she wanted to be, she had no sympathy thereafter, and that ended their relationship, right? So, Jefferson did not like the appointments at all. It threw a monkey wrench. I'll add this because he knew that he had to do something to balance out the judiciary. These are appointments for life. And he was pushed by his Republicans in his first inaugural address not to be so conciliatory, but to go after the Federalists. He was not inclined to do that. That wasn't Jefferson. And then when he didn't do that in his first inaugural address, he was pushed to remove all of them if he could, get rid of them, all of them.
Well, you know, in his first inaugural address, he talked about, you know, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And I know there's probably a certain amount of realpolitik there, but at the same time, it kind of, it exposes his general philosophy of things, I would argue. And
he's not a partisan.
I'm sorry?
He's not partisan.
No, exactly. Absolutely. At least at that point anyway, and probably never, other than the constitutional beliefs.
Yeah, my point has always been his republicanism was not per se a political manifesto or creed. It was a philosophical creed. It was basically the fundamental axioms that any sound political system should employ. Republican or you know, federal, whatever. You know, you have to have respect for the people, government of and by the people, and so forth. So a lot of people are not, you know, don't find my view attractive. I don't care. They're just wrong.
There is a point I'd like to make, that I truly believe that Jefferson did have the desire to keep balance in the government. And I'll tell you what's supporting information why I say that. I do not believe Thomas Jefferson was trying to stack the judiciary in his favor, because he reduced the judiciary from 42 to 30, which left and then minus the 17 commissions that were never delivered, that left 13 positions. He only replaced 5 with people from his party. That left 8 stayed Federalist. He left 8 Federalists in their position.
He was trying to effect a conciliatory approach. He had to do something to placate his hardcore Republicans who expected him to do much more. He was trying to placate them. He also recognized that there needs to be a balance of Republicans and Federalists. His goal was never to remove all the Federalists. Never.
Right. Yeah, I think he wanted to keep a balance in the government.
He thought that probably would wind up being a good thing.
Yeah.
So you're right.
Could you wait? I need to record.
We have it recorded.
I don't say that very often.
I'm gonna faint.
That now is a statement that's for posterity.
That's it. Just wait till I start using metaphors, then you're really in trouble.
All right. Okay. Question number 6. Madison v. Marbury. How did the trial go?
Now we're getting into what's really in. This is the Luke and Laura part about which Donna spoke. And of course, she's watching General Hospital like my grandmother used to. I'm not going to even ask your age, Miss Vitek, since you're talking about Luke and Laura. But I used to watch Dr. Hardy and Nurse, what was her name? Anyway, how did it go? Well, in effect, what JM did, John Marshall, James Madison, is he did nothing. He said a lot. He wanted to, he had a trial, and at the trial, Madison never even showed up. So Jefferson and Madison just sloughing this off like, who cares what's going on? It's not important. They have no right to do anything anyway. And so it wasn't a big thing for the Republicans, I guess, but in a 4-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled with unanimity that it was wrong, illegal for Madison to withhold the delivery of those letters. The letters had been signed by Adams, he says. They had been sealed with the stamp of John Marshall, who's both Secretary of State and head of the Supreme Court. So you got this guy, he's making the decision for an act of which he was a part. And the fact that they weren't delivered is inconsequential. Point is that they're signed and the intent is there. And Jefferson ought to send them and ought to respect the fact that these are legal documents and these people should have their appointments. What happens, he recognizes that there's no constitutional warrant, right? There's no constitutional warrant for Adams doing this in the first place, but he goes, there's no constitutional warrant for the Supreme Court to try to block anybody from doing anything. So he's condemning Jefferson on the one hand and the Jeffersonians, but he's claiming, well, the Constitution doesn't allow me authority to do anything about this. So what I'm doing is just going to give you a slap on the wrist, right? That's what happened at the trial. Now that leads us to the last question, and then we can.
Well, plus he knew Jefferson was not going to follow if he did order it. He knew Jefferson wouldn't follow it.
Very
so
likely
he
not.
didn't want to, to save face, he had to make a decision.
Yeah, I mean, let's go to the last question because this is really what's interesting here.
Okay.
Okay, you ready for the last question?
I guess so.
What finally was the result of the trial? The gain of the judiciary, the gain of the Supreme Court, something else? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, as we know, as the story goes, the Luke and Laura part here, the writ of mandibus was not delivered. John Marshall condemns Jefferson and the Jeffersonians, right? So in some sense, as Donna said, Jefferson wasn't going to comply, more than likely wasn't going to comply anyway. So in effect, by John Marshall saying, I don't have the authority to do anything, in effect, Jefferson, in practice, he's vindicated because he's not forced to do anything that he has to. We know that the Judiciary Act would later be repealed. But in practice, what comes out of this that's really important is that in condemnation of Jefferson, he's interpreting the Constitution in a sense by saying, the way I look at it, by examining the Constitution, Jefferson has no right to withhold Marbury and others from their offices. And the ultimate effect of this that took many decades really to really come fully into play is that Jefferson always thought, like other Republicans and others, even some Federalists, that none of the three branches should have any power, tremendous power over the other branches. In other words, none of them should be in a position to be sole interpreters of the Constitution. Jefferson said, yeah, there are times when the Constitution needs to be interpreted because it's not always perfectly pellucid in terms of what it means, but the executive can interpret it their way. The Congress should be able to examine it, interpret it, and so should the judiciary. They're all independent organizations. What happens with James Madison here is Madison comes in, and the ultimate effect later on is, no, the Supreme Court is that agency. These people elected for life, and that scares the hell out of me, by the way. I don't know how you feel about it, but these people are in there, this small group of people is responsible for being solely responsible for interpreting the Constitution. And we know that today that the Supreme Court, I think John
Judicial
Adams
review.
he also reduced the number of Supreme Court members by one, if I remember correctly, in which case it'd be more difficult to load it with a Republican. So that happens today. That's the interesting thing about this, is that Marshall assumes a position of sort of godlike authority for the Supreme Court for later decades.
That's a great point because, law is precedence, of course, built on that. And you could argue that the logic behind Marbury v. Madison can be seen as recently in the 2012 Supreme Court decision on the Affordable Care Act. Okay. Congress does not have the right to demand of the American people health care, but ACH is a tax. It's not health care made mandatory. I mean, that was the ruling.
Yeah, and there are tons and tons. What did we just get? We just got a there are tons and tons of decisions over the years where the Supreme Court intervenes. The point is, the Supreme Court gets the final word on critical issues in which maybe the executive or the Congress are divided or uncertain. If it becomes uncertain how to interpret the Constitution that comes in, maybe Jefferson's idea to have constitutional renewal every 19 years or so, or every generation, and make it clear it up and keep it up to date might be a better idea, right? We haven't really seen fit to do that. Yeah, this was any other comment? We got about 3.5 minutes.
We have Article 5 of the Constitution gives people, if Congress doesn't amend the Constitution, the American people can do it through the Convention of States.
Excellent.
So, so we can do this. It's not an easy process because we don't want to change the Constitution for every social whim that comes around. That could be very harmful to the country. So, you know, it does need to be an involved process that is not easy to change. For that reason, because think of what would have happened over the past 3 years if we could just change the Constitution.
I was thinking. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I get long-winded. I love the Constitution.
No, you're fine. I was thinking. You got me to thinking about judicial review, and one of the consequences of Marbury v. Madison with judicial review, whether by intent or by accident, is that you even have the Supreme Court engaging in judicial review of sorts. Look at the institution of slavery. You know, first it's constitutional, then it's not. And it's a good thing that it's not, but it was at one time. And the same thing with more recent rulings on, for example, abortion. First it's Roe v. Wade, it's the law of the land, then it's not. And who made the decisions to switch it? The Supreme Court. We're not arguing whether or not those things are justified. Those things are a different issue. We're talking about the march of history and how judicial review also impacts on the court decisions too. Isn't that interesting?
What's nice, what I think is very interesting about this too, is that the Constitution, the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. So anything, if there are no case laws for anything in the Constitution, it's still left to interpretation for everyone.
Well,
it's what
Dave is bringing up is that, you know, the politics of the Supreme Court comes into play as you see with some of these issues and stuff. And, you know,
well, that's because we have two ways of interpreting the Constitution. You have
no, there are not two ways. There's a rational way and irrational way. And the point is, the Supreme Court are they there to pander to the interests of, you know, they're not elected representatives. They're there to seek justice. The fact that we have Federalist and Republican people on the Supreme Court is sort of a travesty. Right, because they're going to be interpreting it through the eyes of a Democrat or Republican today.
Right.
Is that what we want on the Supreme Court? That's not, in my estimation, what we want. We want people are going to look at these issues using full rationality and some semblance of morality in making a just decision. And circumstances today come into play, certainly, right? But that can be a dangerous situation when it becomes politicized. It's always been politicized.
Yeah.
I don't have a solution. We're under 1 minute. Can you bring us home, Donna?
Oh, bring us home.